September 1986. A massive iceberg broke off from the outer edge of the Filchner Shelf Glacier in West Antarctica. It was given a rather nondescript name, A23A. It became immediately clear that it wasn't just large, but the largest one in the world. With an area of about 4,170 square kilometers, 1,610 square miles, it was more than 5 times bigger than New York City. A little later, this giant ran aground for several decades, eventually turning into an ice island. However, in 2023, after more than 30 years, A23A started moving again. Right now, it's drifting in the Weddell Sea along the shores of Antarctica at a speed of over 150 kilometers, 93 miles per month. This event serves as a reminder that something is happening with the icy continent, and it probably isn't good news. Today, you will learn what will happen if all of Antarctica's ice melts, and what will the continent look like then? What is the terrifying, bloody waterfall that erupts straight from the glacier? Why do we constantly find meteorites in Antarctica? Is it true that giant bony-toothed birds once inhabited these places? Will Antarctica ever become green again? And many more amazing facts. Antarctica. Like, support videos, and help YouTube algorithms understand what's interesting. Please support this video by giving it a thumbs up. In terms of human exploration, Antarctica is a relatively new place for us. Ancient maps occasionally depicted vague outlines at the bottom, often labeled as Southern Land or other variations on the theme of terra incognita. In fact, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle mentioned an Antarctic region in his work Meteorology around 350 BC. However, the true discovery and identification of this land as a previously unknown continent didn't occur until the 19th century, which is a very long time. The first confirmed sighting of Antarctica wasn't until 1820. To put that in perspective, by that time, things like the battery, photography, and even fizzy drinks had already been invented. For further context, Columbus discovered America more than 3 centuries earlier. Even then, there was a long debate about what these southern lands truly were. It took another 2 decades for Antarctica to be formally recognized as a continent rather than an island. Since then, as the new continent was studied, a series of increasingly remarkable discoveries captivated the scientific community. It turns out that Antarctica is not just a continent, but actually a rather large one. Its area is over 14.2 million square kilometers, 5.5 million square miles, making it the 5th largest continent, which is almost 1.5 times bigger than the size of the United States. Its coastline stretches almost 18,000 kilometers, 11,200 miles. Yet, Antarctica's size is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. We all know that this is where the planet's largest glaciers are found, with more ice concentrated in this region than anywhere else on Earth. But not everyone knows that Antarctica holds about 90% of the world's ice. That is almost all the ice on the planet. Even if we exclude Antarctic sea glaciers and only consider the continental ones, they cover an area of almost 14 million square kilometers, 5.4 million square miles, and contain a staggering 26.5 million cubic kilometers, 6.4 million cubic miles of ice. A cubic kilometer of ice weighs approximately 0.92 metric gigatons. This means that Antarctica's ice sheet weighs about 24,380,000 gigatons. In some places, it is thicker than 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles. If all this ice were to melt, the global sea level would rise by about 58 meters, 190 feet. To put it mildly, this scenario is very alarming, especially for densely populated coastal areas around the world. Cities like New York or London would simply vanish. Even entire countries like the Netherlands would end up almost entirely underwater. On the other hand, this vast ice reserve isn't just any water, it's fresh water, and it's not very abundant on Earth. About 70% of all the fresh water in the world is stored here. And here is an unexpected twist. Despite its vast ice reserves, Antarctica is considered a desert. In fact, it's the driest one on Earth. This might undoubtedly raise some questions. How can that be? How can a continent with the most water be a desert? It's all about definitions and stereotypes. When we think of deserts, we imagine scorching heat, sandstorms, and dunes. But in reality, a desert isn't just a hot place with lots of sand. It's primarily about precipitation levels. All fancy classifications aside, any region where there's no rain and no fog can be called a desert. And Antarctica perfectly fits this definition. The annual precipitation at the South Pole is only about 50 millimeters, 2 inches. To put that into perspective, the Sahara Desert's average annual precipitation level is about 76 millimeters, 3 inches. While some coastal areas of Antarctica might occasionally witness some form of precipitation, it's sporadic and scant. Hence, on average, the continent's precipitation remains very low. That's why Antarctica is a true desert. It doesn't matter that the continent is covered in a thick layer of ice. It took millions of years to form. To dispel any doubts that might remain, there's a place in Antarctica that hasn't seen any precipitation for 2 million years. We'll discuss this place in more detail in a few minutes. What's unique about Antarctica is that it's neither a country nor anyone's colony, though there are some territorial claims by various nations. Yet, Antarctica has its own phone code, top-level internet domain, .aq, and even a flag. Antarctica is a place where many things don't work the way they normally do, or are even entirely inapplicable. For instance, there's no division into time zones here. Each research station operates on its own time. What time is it in Antarctica right now? We know intuitively that it's a trick question, because the very concept of the day is relative here. If by the daytime we mean the time that it's light outside, then one day at the South Pole lasts 184 of our typical 24-hour days, from September 21st to March 23rd. During this polar day, the sun never sets. It merely traces a circular path along the horizon. Conversely, darkness prevails during the polar night. As such, there are simply no clear markers for day and night here. Naturally, such harsh conditions prevent even crazy romantics from making this place a permanent home. Antarctica has almost no permanent residents. However, at any given time, many people live here, with numbers ranging from 1,000 to 5,000 individuals, depending on the season. All of them are researchers, government personnel, and their families. In the more accessible and relatively hospitable regions of Antarctica, certain criteria must be met by mission participants. However, in the more remote areas, the requirements become even stricter. For instance, people who haven't had their appendix removed might face some clearance issues. What's this strange requirement about? Does Antarctica have some special virus that affects the appendix? It's all about one incident that could have ended in tragedy, but instead became a global sensation. On April 29, 1961, Leonid Rogozov, a 27-year-old Soviet doctor and member of the Antarctic expedition, began experiencing some alarming symptoms: weakness, nausea, fever, and pain in the lower right abdomen. Being the only doctor in the 13-member expedition, he diagnosed himself with acute appendicitis. None of the nearby Antarctic stations had an airplane, and the adverse weather conditions ruled out the patient's evacuation anyway. It seemed like a death sentence. But the brave doctor had the guts to do the unthinkable, to perform an appendectomy on himself. After all, it was the only way to save his life. Skipping the gruesome details of the surgery, let's just say it was extremely challenging. Who would have thought? But successful. And it made the young doctor globally famous. Alright, a day or night spanning half a year already makes Antarctica seem more like a distant exoplanet rather than our Earth. But there's something else that reminds us that we are in space and can occasionally have cosmic visitors. And no, we're not talking about aliens. At least, not just yet. It comes down to something different. Specifically, Antarctica is the perfect place to look for meteorites. Almost 2/3 of all meteorites on Earth were discovered right here. But why is that? While some might jump to conspiracy theories, the actual reason is quite straightforward. It's not that meteorites fall here more frequently, but rather that they're simply easier to find here. Apart from the dry air, the local landscape is just perfect for the search. It's easy to spot dark rocks against the vast snowy expanse. Even when meteorites sink into the snow, the underlying glacial movements prevent them from sinking too deep, so they're almost always close to the surface. In a recent expedition spanning 2022 to 2023, an international research team returned with 5 new samples after a relatively brief search. One of them weighs a whopping 7.6 kilograms, 17 pounds. According to Maria Valdis, a researcher from the Field Museum of Natural History and the University of Chicago, about 45,000 meteorites have been brought from Antarctica in just the last century. And only around 100 of them are of similar or larger size than the largest sample found by the expedition. Here's an unexpected way that Antarctic snow can prove useful. However, Antarctica isn't just made up of snow and ice. The lowest temperature recorded here was in 2010, which is coincidentally the lowest one ever recorded worldwide, minus 92 degrees Celsius, minus 133.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's not all the time and not everywhere on this continent that the polar cold prevails. Take this landscape, for example. Doesn't it resemble the Swiss Alps? But the bottom part of the picture makes a whole difference. Indeed, emperor penguins are found only in Antarctica and nowhere else. And from November to March, when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, even cruise liners make their way to Antarctica. But as you go further south, particularly in the heart of winter, Antarctica unveils its true bone-chilling essence. What else comes to mind when thinking of Antarctica, aside from its ice and cold? Of course, the ozone hole. Everyone has heard of it, but not everyone fully understands its implications. It's an area in the upper layers of the atmosphere with a significant drop in ozone concentration. Just to remind you, the planet's ozone layer is critically important for protecting all living things from harmful solar ultraviolet radiation. Contrary to common misconceptions, the ozone hole over Antarctica isn't something static. It's more of a seasonal phenomenon. The anomaly in the ozone layer over Antarctica was first discovered in 1985. A group of British scientists found that an area of low ozone concentration appears every year in August and virtually vanishes by December. It immediately became clear that this process was an indicator of something more alarming. Scientists wondered, what if this phenomenon progresses? And where did it come from in the first place? The most plausible theory is human activity, specifically the use of chlorofluorocarbons and about 100 other substances. The scientific community immediately raised the alarm. In 1985, the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer was signed. This was followed by the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer in September 1987. Since then, things have been improving. Year after year, researchers witness how the ozone hole is shrinking. Some optimists believe that the Antarctic ozone hole will completely disappear by 2066, a viewpoint even reflected in a UN report. However, recent years have given us a new cause for concern, especially the current year of 2023. Satellite data from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts revealed an alarming trend. The ozone hole over Antarctica began forming unusually early this year, in fact, as early as August, and scientists were genuinely alarmed by this phenomenon. As Dr. Martin Jaker, a researcher from the Climate Change Research Center at the University of New South Wales, stated, "Such an early formation is very unexpected. If the ozone hole expands beyond its typical size, it could cause the waters of the Southern Ocean to warm up even more. And currently, the region is witnessing a record low level of sea ice. Increased ultraviolet radiation will also affect wind patterns, further contributing to the ice level decline." One can't help but think, 2023, enough already. It's too much to handle. But for now, there's still too little information to draw definitive conclusions. While Antarctica remains a formidable environment, it's a perfect time for us to delve into its most captivating and mysterious sights. Let's start with something that you wouldn't find surprising anywhere else on the planet: a river. Nothing seems out of the ordinary with a flowing river, but for Antarctica, it's quite an attraction. This is the Onyx River. At just 32 kilometers, 20 miles long, it holds the title of the longest river in Antarctica. What makes this river truly unique is its behavior. It only flows for about 2 months a year. For most of the year, the river is dormant. With its bed being frozen, it feels as if time itself has almost stopped. However, during the short Antarctic summer, a magical transformation occurs. The Onyx River springs to life and starts to flow. Antarctica's unique hydrological system plays a crucial role in the way the Onyx River behaves. The continent is covered in a thick layer of ice, with a complex network of subglacial lakes and streams lying within and beneath it. When the summer sun warms the surface of the ice, meltwater trickles down, accumulating in these subglacial reservoirs. The pressure eventually becomes too great, forcing the water to the surface, giving birth to rivers like the Onyx. The short but intense flow period of the Onyx River creates a vital ecosystem amidst the barren landscape. Its cold waters flowing through the valley nourish the scarce life that can exist here. The river contains no fish, but it does have microorganisms and algae, and one could see them blooming. The Onyx River becomes a lifeline for them in the harsh environmental conditions. But what's even more mind-blowing is where the river flows. It flows in the driest place on the planet. So dry that even certain areas of the Atacama Desert, where it hasn't rained for 400 years, would seem like an oasis compared to it. Because in this place, there has been no precipitation for 2 million years. These are the so-called McMurdo dry valleys, lying to the west of the McMurdo Sound, specifically the valleys of Victoria, Wright, and Taylor. They are vast lowlands with steep slopes carved out by long-gone glaciers. Combined, they cover about 8,000 square kilometers, 3,088 square miles of Antarctic land. They are also referred to as Antarctic oases, precisely because they are not covered in ice or snow. But of course, they have nothing in common with what we typically call oases. In fact, they are the complete opposite. In places like the Sahara, oases are islands of life, whereas the McMurdo dry valleys are quite literally the most lifeless places on the planet. researchers couldn't find any signs of life in soil samples taken from this driest and coldest place. One can't help but compare it to other planets, perhaps Mars, and rightfully so. The dry valleys so closely resemble Martian conditions that NASA used them as testing grounds for the Viking landers. Moreover, some of the mysteries of this land are too challenging for modern scientists to comprehend. For instance, there are mummified seal carcasses scattered throughout the valleys. They decompose very slowly in the cold, dry air. Therefore, it's quite likely that some of these animals might have wandered here and died hundreds or even thousands of years ago. What they were seeking in this desolate place remains a mystery. The only theory suggests that the seals galumped their way into the valleys because they were disoriented. Weakened and stranded, they eventually succumbed to the harsh conditions. One way or another, the question remains, why is it so dry here that there's virtually no life at all? The fact is that much of Antarctica's snow and ice cover didn't form as a result of typical precipitation like snowfall. Instead, it's largely due to condensation from the atmosphere. It's somewhat similar to the frost in old refrigerators without no frost systems. The annual precipitation in the dry valleys is only 25 millimeters, almost 1 inch. But even these scant amounts evaporate without transitioning into a liquid phase. The air humidity here is very low due to the periodic katabatic winds. These are cold and dry air currents, sometimes reaching speeds of 320 kilometers, 200 miles per hour. And this is another record, the highest speed of permanent winds on Earth. As a result, the valleys have stayed almost ice-free for about 8 million years. As paradoxical as it may sound, nestled within the Taylor Valley, right next to the driest place on the planet, there is a waterfall. And not just any waterfall, but none other than the Blood Falls. At least that's what it's called, and the color red really looks pretty convincing. It's one of the most striking landmarks of Antarctica. The name Blood Falls is of course metaphorical, but just take a look. The way it looks is undoubtedly unsettling. This place was discovered in 1911 by the Australian geologist Griffith Taylor, who lent his name to the glacier. Back then, Taylor and his team hypothesized that the color was due to red algae. However, this assumption was later challenged. According to one of the most plausible theories, the blood-red color of the waterfall is actually the result of a complex chemical reaction. This reaction has been ongoing for 1.5 million years as water passes through an endless network of cracks and passages within the glacier. Researchers often refer to this water as a liquid time capsule. Upon contact with the open air, the salty water forms iron oxides and turns blood red after being trapped under high pressure within the glacier with no sunlight or oxygen exposure. Moreover, this body of water contains microbes that live in high-pressure environments and feed on sulfates. Scientists had never observed such a natural phenomenon anywhere else before. Surprisingly, these discoveries have made Blood Falls a popular site for astrobiological research. For instance, a study conducted by the University of Tennessee showed that a total of 17 types of microbes thrive within the glacier. Each of them provides invaluable insights into Earth's conditions 700 million years ago, as well as the potential habitability of Mars, Europa, and Titan. Who would have thought that this remote corner of the world could provide answers to the question, could other planets and moons form and sustain life? And now, for the sake of contrast, let's shift our focus from the valleys to their complete opposite, mountains. Antarctica has plenty of these landmarks. The highest mountain on the continent is the Vinson Massif. Its height is 4,892 meters, 16,050 feet above sea level. For context, Mont Blanc, the tallest alpine peak, is 4,807 meters, 15,773 feet, which is a little bit shorter. While the presence of mountains in Antarctica might hardly impress anyone, what may come as a surprise is that Antarctica has active volcanoes. The tallest is Mount Erebus, standing at 3,794 meters, 12,448 feet above sea level. The volcano has been active for about 1.3 million years. Inside the crater at its summit, there is a long-lived lava lake, which has existed since at least the early 1970s. Unfortunately, Mount Erebus is also associated with tragic events. The most notable is the 1979 plane crash. On November 28th, the Air New Zealand DC-10 passenger plane crashed head-on into the side of the volcano. 257 people died as a result of the crash, including all passengers and all 20 crew members. Indeed, Antarctica can sometimes be dangerous even for those who reasonably feel safe, not to mention those brave souls who knowingly faced mortal danger in pursuit of scientific discovery. And now, some unique Antarctic artifacts will forever remind us of their heroism. They stand as remarkable natural monuments to the courageous pioneers, even though initially they were just temporary shelters. We're talking about the historic huts that once provided shelter to some legendary figures. Researchers and scientists who spent any amount of time in Antarctica built their dwellings here. And now these huts have become man-made landmarks of the continent. For instance, there are 3 such historic huts on Ross Island. The island was discovered by Sir James Clark Ross in 1841 and was considered part of the mainland. It was only between 1901 and 1904 that the British National Antarctic Expedition recognized it as an island and named it after Ross. The huts were built and used by explorers Scott and Shackleton during the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration, spanning from 1898 to 1922. Shackleton's hut is a beautifully preserved cozy wooden house built in 1907 by the legendary British explorer. The house measures 10 by 6 meters, 33 by 20 feet, with separate areas designed for dogs, ponies, and the island's first motor vehicle. Inside, one can find glass jars filled with medicines on the shelves, an old sleeping bag on a bed, and cans of preserved food on the floor. It's an amazing time capsule. The interior looks as if the hut was only recently vacated by the people who built it. All this food on the shelves, socks hung up after washing, and even bread still sits on the tables just the way they left it. Scott's hut, also located on Ross Island and dating back to 1911, is equally fascinating. It was custom built in England and then shipped to Antarctica in a disassembled form. In February 1912, an annex and a stable were added to the hut. However, during that year's winter, the hut had several minor fires. When members of Scott's expedition departed in January 1913, they left behind enough supplies to sustain a dozen people for over a year. Many of the provisions remain in the hut even today and are still edible, all due to the exceptional dryness and low temperatures of the region. Of course, huts could be interesting, but they are essentially museums now. What about an entire town in Antarctica? A real one with a bank branch, a kindergarten, an elementary school, a library, a Catholic chapel, a military and civilian hospital, a supermarket, and even a souvenir shop. What's more, there's postal service, mobile communication, radio, television, and the internet. This is Villa Las Estrellas, or Star Town in Spanish. It's a Chilean settlement situated at President Eduardo Frei Montalva Base in Antarctica, within the Antarctic commune of the Chilean Antarctic province. It's one of only 2 permanently populated settlements in Antarctica. Admittedly, calling it a city might be a bit of a stretch. Its population ranges from 80 to 150 residents, depending on the season. and the local post office looks something like this. Nevertheless, technically, all the listed hallmarks of civilization are there and functional. Of course, there are plenty of challenges. For instance, since 2018, all residents, including children, have been required to undergo an appendectomy before arriving at Villas Las Estrellas. This is done as a precaution, as medical services on site are quite limited. However, the most significant landmark on Antarctica is, of course, the South Pole. This almost magical place has a bunch of other names: the geographic South Pole, the terrestrial South Pole, and the 90th southern parallel. It's the southernmost point on Earth, which lies opposite the North Pole at a distance of 20,004 kilometers, 12,430 miles in all directions. It's one of the 2 points where the Earth's rotation axis intersects its surface. The South Pole is located on an inconspicuous, barren, wind-swept, icy plateau at an elevation of 2,835 meters, 9,301 feet above sea level. It's roughly 1,300 kilometers, 810 miles away from the nearest open sea at the Bay of Whales. So if you're fortunate enough to visit the South Pole, the backdrop for your photos will be an austere, minimalist landscape. Now try to guess what marks the exact point of the South Pole: the US flag or the metal rod on the right? The correct answer is the metal rod. Interestingly, it's moved annually to compensate for the glacial ice movement. But if you're now feeling a sense of the loneliness and abandonment of this place, we're here to either delight or disappoint you, depending on your perspective. The Amundsen Scott South Pole Station operates right near the geographic South Pole, and it looks quite presentable. Now, the sense of solitude might not be as profound as it was at first. For those keen on photo sessions, there's a specifically designated spot here: the so-called ceremonial South Pole. Nonetheless, despite the seemingly populated South Pole and humanity's inherent drive to explore and expand, Antarctica remains an extremely austere environment. And if conditions were even slightly more hospitable, various forms of life would undoubtedly thrive here. There was such a period in the continent's history. Instead of the vast ice expanses, lush vegetation covered the land, and dinosaurs, along with a myriad of smaller creatures, roamed the place. And to learn the details, we'll have to dig deeper, both metaphorically and literally, because the answers lie beneath Antarctica's ice. For starters, it would be fascinating to see what Antarctica looks like for real. That is, without all its massive ice sheets. After all, how do we know that there's anything under this ice at all? What if, once the ice is removed, Antarctica will simply disappear, leaving only a couple of islands behind? By the way, there was a time when the scientific community entertained the idea that Antarctica isn't a continent at all, but merely an archipelago with extremely thick ice that makes it look like a continent. But as research progressed and technology advanced, scientists came to a consensus on the actual outlines of Antarctica's landmass. According to the most recent data, the continent looks like this. Indeed, the abundance of greenish hues here is no accident. Between 145 and 66 million years ago, palms grew on Antarctica's shores, and the average temperature in deep continental regions was around 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists refer to this period as the Eocene greenhouse, a time when high carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere led to a greenhouse effect. But it wasn't just the greenhouse effect that contributed to the great biodiversity that prevailed in ancient Antarctica. The continent itself was much closer to the equator, and only after millions of years did it begin to drift towards the South Pole. During this period, forests thrived across the continent. Today, only the fossils of plants and cold-blooded animals remain as a testament to the past. a sharp climate change, which began 34 million years ago during the Eocene-Oligocene extinction, initiated a series of complex, not entirely understood processes that reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the planet's atmosphere. This led to global cooling and ultimately resulted in Antarctica's almost complete glaciation. Before we delve right under the ice, we should first consider what lies in its depths. Contrary to what one might assume, these vast expanses of frozen water are far from lifeless. It's been long known that glaciers can harbor cavities where water accumulates, sometimes forming vast and uniquely shaped reservoirs. With a bit of a stretch, we can call such water-filled cavities lakes. And for the ice of Antarctica, such lakes are not uncommon. However, lakes that existed even before Antarctica was covered in ice are of much greater scientific interest. Scientists predicted their existence as early as the 1950s. Luckily, they were soon discovered. The largest of these lakes was found in the late 1990s. This is Lake Vostok, which was named after the Russian Antarctic station Vostok. However, found might be too strong a word here. Scientists could only infer that it existed based on some indirect evidence. After all, the lake's surface was hidden beneath 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles of ice. Subsequent radar research revealed the following picture. That's definitely something down there. And that's when everyone got excited. After all, even the immense ice sheet above the lake serves as a unique history book. It preserves information about the state of our planet from hundreds, thousands, and even millions of years ago. From these ice samples, one can determine the amount of dust in the atmosphere, the level of gaseous impurities, and the water composition at a specific point in time. However, the real cherry on top is the water in the lake itself. According to scientists, it's a real time capsule, and the lake itself is quite large to say the least, stretching 160 miles in length and 30 miles in width at its broadest. It covers an area of 12,500 square kilometers, 4,830 square miles. There's plenty of room for animals of any size. However, scientists were quite reserved about what could actually be found there. There might not be anything interesting at all in this separate world, which has been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. Drilling efforts to reach the lake began as far back as 1989, but it wasn't until 2012 that they reached the surface. The initial study of the core obtained from the lake's frozen water yielded astonishing results. About 4,000 species of bacteria were discovered, thriving in extreme conditions. And this isn't about the low temperature, but primarily about the pressure. All those miles of ice above created a pressure of about 300 atmospheres. While this is hardly the Mariana Trench with its 1,071 atmospheres, it's still a lot. However, the initial excitement was short-lived. It turned out that the colorful palette of single-celled organisms had contaminated the lake water from the drilling fluid, and in reality, there wasn't virtually anything in Lake Vostok, at least in its surface waters. We say almost because something was indeed discovered. The bacterium W123-10 found in the ice frozen onto the drill bit genetically matched known species by less than 86%. You might ask, so what? The thing is, in order to classify an organism as a particular species, scientists need a genetic match of 90% or higher. This means that the discovered bacterium is definitely something new, previously unknown to science. Of course, this isn't what the daydreamers expected, as we've discovered just bacteria and not some whimsical mythical creatures. But the research is still ongoing, and perhaps we won't be disappointed for long. After all, Antarctica is quite generous with ancient artifacts featuring some complex life forms. For instance, fossils of remarkable ancient creatures. Astonishing discoveries happen all the time, and some of them are just mind-blowing. For example, in 2020, the scientific community was virtually shocked by a report published in Nature. The authors discussed discovering the remains of a terrifying, giant, bony-toothed bird species in Antarctica. To be precise, these remains were discovered quite some time ago, back in the 1980s. But for some reason, the significance of this incredible find eluded scientists at that time. It turned out that one of these ancient remains belonged to a massive bird species that once ruled the skies above the oceans. These formidable creatures indeed had impressive teeth, albeit not real ones. These creatures are known as pelagornithids, an extinct group of predatory seabirds. They're also called bony-toothed birds because of the bony projections on their beaks. These structures resembled real teeth, but weren't genuine teeth. However, it's unlikely that this distinction was of any consolation to their prey. Pelagornithids thrived for tens of millions of years. The oldest known fossils of these birds date back 62 million years, while the most recent are around 2.5 million years old. The ecological niche occupied by these animals is equivalent to that of modern albatrosses. They soared above the sea, scanning the waters below for prey, namely fish and cephalopods. What truly astonished scientists was this animal's size. Based on the discovered bones, researchers estimated that these monsters had a wingspan of 5 to 6 meters, 16 to 19 feet. Our fossil discovery, with its estimate of a 5 to 6 meter wingspan, nearly 20 feet, shows that birds evolved to a truly gigantic size relatively quickly after the extinction of the dinosaurs and ruled over the oceans for millions of years, summarized Peter Klaus, the paper's lead author. Peter Klaus from the University of California, Berkeley. Similar fossils have been found in Antarctica before, and there's likely much more yet to be discovered. Studies have shown that in ancient times, the Southern Ocean could warm up to 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, facilitating the rapid development of flora and fauna. A particularly hot period occurred in the mid-Cretaceous, when carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere created a significant greenhouse effect. Most likely, the primary driver of this temperature surge was volcanic activity. Scientists constantly ponder how closely the processes of the Cretaceous period resemble what's happening now. Could Antarctica once again become entirely ice-free? Many experts believe that the current rates of global warming are unprecedented in Earth's history. Even the largest volcanoes cannot emit as much carbon dioxide as modern industry produces. West Antarctica has already begun to melt. Scientists note that given the rate of ice retreat, it's unlikely we'll see this continent turn green in the coming decades. And frankly, we wouldn't really want to, given the inevitable rise in global sea levels. But the processes are undeniably underway. Accelerated sea levels will accelerate the destruction and melting of glaciers. Antarctica will likely turn green again in the not-so-distant future. However, it's hard to comprehend what will happen to the rest of the Earth once the poles have completely melted.